Miss Arabella Fairfax stood before the assembled gentlemen of the Royal Society, with her heart beating a rhythm that matched the ticking of the great clock in the corner of the lecture hall, her hands resting on either side of the lectern, where 3 years of meticulous astronomical observations lay spread in careful charts and mathematical calculations that represented every clear night she had spent in her late father's observatory, recording the movements of celestial bodies with a precision that would have made him proud. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of the grand hall, illuminating the mahogany paneling and the stern portraits of scientific luminaries who seemed to gaze down with judgment upon this unprecedented sight of a woman standing where only men had stood before, and Arabella drew strength from the memory of her father's voice telling her that the stars cared nothing for the gender of those who studied them, only for the accuracy of their observations. She had prepared for this moment with the same care she applied to her nightly observations, her dove-grey dress chosen for its modest propriety, her dark hair arranged in a simple style that suggested seriousness rather than vanity, and her notes organized with such precision that she could find any calculation or reference without fumbling. Yet, despite all her preparation, she could not control the sea of dark-suited gentlemen who filled every seat and lined the walls, their expressions ranging from polite skepticism to outright disdain. A wall of masculine judgment that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. When she began speaking, her voice emerged stronger than she had dared hope, the passion for her work overriding her nervousness as she described the perturbations she had observed in the orbit of Uranus, the careful measurements she had taken over 36 months of observation, and the mathematical calculations that suggested these irregularities could only be explained by the gravitational influence of another celestial body, a planet beyond Saturn that completed its orbit every 164 years according to her projections, and for a few precious moments she forgot the hostile audience and lost herself in the beauty of the mathematics, the elegant dance of celestial mechanics that had consumed her thoughts and dreams for 3 years. If my calculations prove correct, she explained with growing confidence, this celestial body completes its orbit every 164 years, which would explain the perturbations I have observed in the movement of Uranus, and I have verified these observations repeatedly across different seasons and atmospheric conditions to ensure their accuracy. The orbital eccentricity, suggesting an axial tilt that would account for the specific gravitational effects I have documented. She was reaching for the star chart that would illustrate her next point when a voice cut through her. Explanation like a blade through silk, cultured and mocking, belonging to Viscount Edmund Tilney, who sat in the 3rd row with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to occupy any space he chose, his handsome features arranged in an expression of amused condescension as he interrupted without bothering to wait for the question period that should have followed her presentation. "Miss Fairfax," he drawled, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the hall, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm, perhaps you might better apply your observational skills to more suitable feminine pursuits, and I am told that needlework requires quite excellent attention to detail, the kind of meticulous work that seems to interest you so greatly." The laughter that followed his words rippled through the assembled gentlemen like wind through wheat, starting with nervous chuckles from those nearest Edmund, and building to open guffaws from men who seemed relieved to have permission to express the skepticism they had been restraining, and Arabella felt the sound strike her like physical blows, each laugh a denial of the 3 years she had devoted to this work, each chuckle a dismissal of her father's legacy and her own capabilities. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the lectern until her knuckles went white, and she forced herself to meet Edmund's eyes across the rows of laughing men, seeing in his handsome face a calculated cruelty that went beyond simple prejudice into something more personal, as though her very presence in this hall offended him on a fundamental level that required public correction. "My observations are mathematically sound," she said, hating the way her voice broke on the final word, the tremor betraying the emotion she had fought so hard to suppress. I have verified them repeatedly over 3 years, and the calculations are based on established principles of celestial mechanics and gravitational theory that any competent astronomer would recognize as valid. Edmund rose from his seat with theatrical slowness, adjusting his cuffs in a gesture that drew all eyes to him and away from Arabella, transforming the moment into his performance rather than her presentation. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of authority and masculine certainty that the room had been waiting for, the permission to dismiss what made them uncomfortable. "My dear girl," he said, the condescension in those 3 words more cutting than any open insult could have been. "Mathematics is a rigorous discipline, not a parlor game for young ladies seeking attention, and I have taken the trouble to review your so-called calculations and found them based on flawed assumptions and wishful thinking rather than sound scientific methodology, the kind of feminine fancy that your dear late father would surely have been mortified to see masquerading as serious astronomical work." The mention of her father struck deeper than anything else Edmund had said, implying that her work dishonored the man who had taught her to love the stars, who had built the observatory where she had conducted her observations, who had encouraged her to pursue astronomical study even when society suggested she should focus on finding a husband instead. And Arabella felt her vision blur with tears she absolutely refused to let fall in front of these men who already thought her too emotional and irrational for scientific work. She looked down at her charts spread across the lectern, seeing through blurred vision the careful notations she had made on cold winter nights and warm summer evenings, the mathematical proofs she had worked through with such care, the star maps she had drawn with her own hand to document each observation, and all of it suddenly seemed small and foolish under the weight of masculine laughter that continued to echo off the vaulted ceiling, bouncing between the portraits of great scientists who had never had to prove their right to pursue knowledge. Edmund was still speaking, holding forth to an audience that now hung on his every word, explaining with the patience of a tutor correcting a slow student why her observations must be in error, why her calculations could not possibly be accurate, why women lacked the necessary rigor of mind for true scientific work, no matter how earnest their efforts might be. And with each word Arabella felt something inside her crumbling, the dream she had cherished of being taken seriously as an astronomer dissolving like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Her hands shook as she began gathering her charts and papers, trying to organize them with some dignity even as her fingers fumbled and several sheets slipped from her grasp to flutter toward the floor, and she bent to retrieve them with burning cheeks while the laughter continued and Edmund accepted congratulations from the men nearest him for protecting the society's reputation from feminine encroachment. She straightened with her precious papers clutched against her chest like a shield, no longer able to meet the eyes of any man in that room, and she walked from the lectern with her head high through sheer force of will, each step toward the door feeling like a mile traversed while running a gauntlet, the masculine laughter following her retreat and echoing in her ears even after she passed through the doorway into the entrance hall where afternoon light fell in geometric patterns across marble floors. Behind her she could hear Edmund's voice rising above the general conversation, something about maintaining standards and the natural limitations of the female intellect, and she knew without looking back that he stood in the space she had vacated, receiving the approbation and respect that should have been hers. If only she had been born male, if only her calculations and observations had been presented by a man whose work would have been judged on its merits rather than dismissed because of the gender of its author. The walk through the entrance hall felt endless, her footsteps echoing in the vast space, while her mind replayed every moment of the humiliation, every laugh and dismissive comment, every word of Edmund's calculated mockery that had reduced 3 years of serious scientific work to the fanciful imaginings of a spinster seeking attention she could not obtain through conventional feminine means. And by the time she emerged onto the street where her carriage waited, Arabella had made a decision that felt like accepting defeat, even as some small part of her whispered that it was merely pragmatic acceptance of reality. She would return to Fairfax Manor and close her father's observatory, pack away the telescope and charts and calculations, and accept what society had been telling her all along, that some pursuits were simply not meant for women, no matter how passionate their interest or careful their methodology, that the stars and planets would continue their eternal dance, observed and documented by men, while she retreated to the acceptable feminine sphere of drawing rooms and social calls and the slow death of dreams that had once burned as bright as any celestial body in the night sky. 3 days had passed since the humiliation at the Royal Society, and Arabella had spent every waking hour in her father's observatory at Fairfax Manor, 20 miles from London, where the air felt cleaner and the memories less suffocating, though she knew that distance could not truly separate her from the shame that clung to her like morning fog, refusing to burn away under weak autumn sunlight. The observatory occupied the converted tower room at the eastern corner of the manor house, a circular space with a domed ceiling that opened to reveal the night sky, and every surface bore the marks of her father's lifelong passion for astronomy in the form of brass instruments that gleamed even in dim light, star charts that covered the walls in careful astronomical notation, and leather-bound notebooks filled with decades of observations written in his precise hand that she could not bear to disturb. She had risen that morning without bothering to arrange her hair beyond a simple plait, had dressed in a plain day dress of faded blue that she normally reserved for gardening, and had climbed the spiral stairs to the observatory with the intention of cataloguing her observations one final time before packing them away in the trunk where her father's earliest work resided, consigning her own efforts to the same dusty oblivion that awaited all failed scientific endeavors. The brass telescope stood in the center of the room like a silent witness to her defeat, its lenses requiring cleaning that she had been putting off because the task felt too much like saying goodbye. But this morning she had finally gathered the soft cloths and cleaning solution her father had taught her to use, approaching the instrument with the reverence one might show at a funeral, each careful stroke of the cloth against the brass fittings feeling like a farewell ritual for dreams that had died in a lecture hall full of laughing men. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the narrow windows, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the floor where her charts lay scattered in half-hearted attempts at organization, and the scent of old paper and brass polish filled the air with a familiar comfort that made her throat tighten with unshed tears. She had forbidden herself to cry, because crying would mean admitting that Edmund Tilney had broken something inside her that she did not know how to repair. She was bent over the telescope's primary lens, breathing carefully on the glass before wiping it with gentle circular motions when she heard footsteps on the spiral stairs, the heavy tread of boots that did not belong to any of the household servants, and she straightened with irritation blooming in her chest because she had left explicit instructions that she was not to be disturbed, that she needed solitude to complete her work, though what she really needed was privacy for her grief over the death of her astronomical ambitions. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and a man entered the observatory without knocking, his height requiring him to duck slightly beneath the doorframe, and Arabella turned with words of dismissal already forming on her lips until she recognized Sebastian Wentworth, the Duke of Hartfield, whose presence in her private sanctuary made no sense whatsoever, because dukes did not ride 20 miles from London to visit spinster astronomers in their secluded observatories without some ulterior motive she could not begin to guess. "If you have come to offer pity or paternal advice about accepting my limitations, Your Grace," she said without looking up from her work, her voice flat and bitter in a way that would have horrified her aunt, who believed young ladies should always maintain pleasant tones regardless of their inner turmoil, "then you have wasted your journey, and I would appreciate being left to my tasks." She expected him to make excuses and retreat, perhaps after delivering whatever platitudes he had rehearsed during his ride, but instead he moved further into the room with the careful steps of someone entering a sacred space, his eyes moving across the charts and instruments with an expression of genuine interest rather than the polite curiosity aristocrats typically displayed toward things that bored them, but which they felt obligated to acknowledge. "I have come to discuss the orbital eccentricity of your proposed planet," he said, his voice carrying none of the condescension she had braced herself to hear. "And your calculations suggest a 17-degree axial tilt, which is fascinating. But I wonder if you have considered how that might affect the gravitational perturbations you observed in Uranus during the winter months when atmospheric distortion would be at its minimum." Arabella spun around so quickly that she nearly dropped the cleaning cloth, her heart suddenly beating faster as she stared at this unexpected visitor, who had just referenced specific details from her calculations that she had not included in her Royal Society presentation, details that existed only in her full written work that Edmund had dismissed without reading and that she had assumed no one else would bother to examine. "You have read my actual calculations?" she said slowly, the words emerging as a question, though she had intended them as a statement, not merely the summary I presented to the Society, but the complete mathematical framework and observational data. Sebastian pulled a sheaf of papers from inside his coat, and even from across the room, Arabella could see her own handwriting covered with additional notes in a different hand, elegant script that filled the margins and added calculations between her lines, evidence of careful study rather than cursory dismissal. "Every page," he confirmed, and twice because the first reading left me with questions that required verification against my own observations. "And I must tell you, Miss Fairfax, that your mathematical framework is extraordinary in its elegance and precision, though I believe there is an error in your third assumption that when corrected actually strengthens your entire thesis rather than weakening it." The word error should have stung after Edmund's public mockery of her flawed assumptions, but something in Sebastian's tone suggested collaboration rather than criticism. The kind of intellectual engagement she had only ever experienced with her father, and despite her determination to remain defensive and aloof, Arabella found herself asking what sort of error with genuine curiosity overriding her wounded pride. Sebastian moved to the large work table where her charts lay scattered and began spreading out the pages he had brought, his movements careful and respectful of the space, as though he understood that he stood in someone's private sanctuary and should behave accordingly. "May I show you?" he asked, glancing up at her with eyes that held none of the mockery or condescension she had learned to expect from men discussing her work, "because this will take some time and require both your observational data and my own, and I wonder if you have a chalkboard where we might work through the mathematics together." Arabella hesitated, every instinct screaming that this must be some elaborate trick or cruel joke, that no duke would ride from London to discuss astronomical calculations with a woman who had been publicly humiliated for presuming to engage in scientific work. Yet she could see her papers covered in his notes and calculations that demonstrated genuine engagement with her theories, and the intellectual hunger that had driven her astronomical studies for 3 years proved stronger than her caution or her pride. She crossed to the corner where her father's chalkboard stood and wheeled it to the center of the room, the familiar screech of chalk against slate as Sebastian began writing equations filling the observatory with a sound she had thought she would never hear again. The sound of serious scientific work being conducted in partnership rather than in isolation. He explained his thinking as he wrote, his chalk moving rapidly across the board to demonstrate how her assumption about the planet's density could be refined based on his own observations of similar gravitational perturbations. And Arabella found herself drawn into the discussion despite her intentions to remain detached, pointing out where his corrections aligned with her data and where they suggested modifications to her original calculations. The afternoon sunlight shifted across the floor as they worked, neither of them noticing the passage of time as they moved between the chalkboard and the charts, comparing observations and testing theories with the kind of intellectual excitement that made Arabella forget for long stretches that she was supposed to be cataloguing her work for permanent storage rather than actively developing it further. Sebastian treated her as an equal partner in the discussion, never talking down or explaining concepts she clearly understood, instead building on her knowledge and challenging her thinking in ways that sharpened rather than diminished her contributions. And she realized with something like wonder that this was what collaboration should feel like. Two minds working together toward understanding rather than one mind asserting dominance over another through mockery and dismissal. When the sun began to set and shadows gathered in the corners of the observatory, Arabella moved automatically to light the oil lamps that hung at intervals around the room, their warm glow creating an intimate atmosphere that transformed the space from a scientific workplace into something that felt almost conspiratorial. Two people united in pursuit of knowledge against a world that would prefer they abandon such pursuits. Sebastian had removed his coat at some point during their work, his waistcoat marked with chalk dust that he seemed not to notice, and his hair had fallen forward over his forehead in a way that made him look less like a duke and more like the dedicated scholar he apparently was beneath the aristocratic title. "Your modifications to my third assumption are correct," Arabella admitted as they stood together examining the revised calculations on the chalkboard, "and I can see now that my original density estimate was too conservative, which explains why my predicted orbital period was slightly longer than the gravitational perturbations would suggest. But how did you recognize this error when no one else even bothered to read beyond the first page of my calculations?" Sebastian turned to look at her, his expression serious in the lamplight that cast shadows across his face and made his eyes difficult to read. "Because I have been conducting my own observations from my estate's observatory at Hartfield," he said quietly. "And I observed the same perturbations you documented but could not account for them with existing planetary models. And when I read your work, I recognized immediately that you had found the answer I had been seeking, though your calculations needed refinement that could only come from combining your data with mine." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I would like to propose a collaboration, Miss Fairfax, a partnership to prove your theory and demonstrate the existence of this new planet. But it would need to be conducted in secret to protect you from further mockery while we verify the mathematics and refine the observations to the point where they cannot be dismissed by men like Tilney, who would rather defend their prejudices than acknowledge truth." Arabella studied his face in the lamplight, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but finding only genuine enthusiasm for the work and what appeared to be sincere respect for her abilities, and she felt something inside her chest that had been tight and cold since the Royal Society lecture begin to loosen and warm. "Why would you do this?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the hope that wanted to rise and choke her words. "Why would a duke risk his reputation to collaborate with a woman who has been publicly dismissed as a foolish spinster playing at science?" Sebastian met her eyes directly, his gaze unwavering. "Because your work is brilliant, Miss Fairfax, and because the stars do not care about the gender of those who study them, only about the accuracy of the observations and the elegance of the mathematics. And because I have been alone in my astronomical pursuits for too long and would welcome a partner who understands that the pursuit of knowledge matters more than the approval of fools." The words hung in the air between them, illuminated by lamplight and surrounded by the tools of astronomical observation, and Arabella made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness, while simultaneously feeling like coming home to a place she had been seeking without knowing it existed, agreeing to Sebastian's proposal of secret collaboration, while knowing that she was also agreeing to something more, to hope renewed and dreams revived, and the possibility that perhaps not all men were like Edmund Tilney, that perhaps somewhere in the world there existed those rare individuals who valued mind over gender and truth over prejudice and the advancement of knowledge over the preservation of comfortable assumptions about what women could and could not achieve. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The pattern established itself within a week and continued for 2 months that transformed Arabella's world, from the grey defeat that had settled over Fairfax Manor into something bright and purposeful that made her rise each morning with anticipation rather than dread. And twice weekly, Sebastian Wentworth rode from London ostensibly to pay social calls on Miss Fairfax and her aunt, but actually to spend hours in the observatory, engaged in the kind of serious astronomical work that was reshaping both their understanding of celestial mechanics and something far more dangerous in the landscape of Arabella's carefully guarded heart. The routine became as reliable as the movement of stars across the night sky, beginning with afternoon tea in the drawing room, where Lady Beatrice Fairfax presided with the sharp eyes and sharper wit of a woman who had spent 60 years observing human nature with the same precision her brother had applied to observing celestial bodies, and she watched the Duke of Hartfield discuss weather and local news with her niece, while his gaze kept drifting toward the eastern tower, where the observatory waited like a secret they both pretended not to be eager to reach. After the proper interval of social niceties had been observed, Sebastian would suggest a walk in the gardens to enjoy the fine weather or the autumn colours or whatever excuse seemed appropriate to the season, and Arabella would agree with carefully performed surprise, as though the idea had not occurred to her, and Lady Beatrice would smile in a way that suggested she knew perfectly well that garden walks in October required considerably more time than the weather warranted, but she approved of whatever was happening in that observatory because her niece had stopped looking like a woman in mourning and started looking like a woman alive. The observatory became their world, a circular room that existed outside the normal rules of society, where a duke could remove his coat and roll up his shirt sleeves to write equations on a chalkboard, and a spinster astronomer could challenge his calculations without worrying that her intelligence would be seen as unfeminine aggression. And the oil lamps they lit as afternoon faded into evening created pools of warm, golden light that transformed scientific instruments into something almost magical, brass and glass gleaming in the dimness, while outside the domed ceiling, the stars emerged one by one to witness their work. Arabella found herself taking more care with her appearance on the days Sebastian was expected, choosing dresses in deeper colours that brought out the warmth in her complexion, arranging her hair with attention. She had abandoned after the Royal Society humiliation, and she told herself this renewed interest in her appearance stemmed from professional pride rather than personal vanity, from wanting to look like a serious scientist rather than from wanting to see appreciation in Sebastian's eyes when he arrived to find her already at work in the observatory. Sebastian too underwent a transformation over those 2 months. The formal duke who had first arrived in immaculate riding clothes and perfect cravat, gradually giving way to a more relaxed version, who appeared with chalk dust on his waistcoat from previous calculations, whose dark hair fell forward over his forehead when he bent over star charts, and whose genuine smiles came more frequently as their partnership deepened from cautious collaboration into something that felt like friendship, and perhaps more than friendship, though neither of them spoke the word aloud. Their work progressed with the kind of intensity that only comes from true intellectual partnership, combining her 3 years of meticulous observations with his superior equipment and mathematical training to refine the calculations that would prove the existence of the planet beyond Saturn. And they developed a rhythm of working together that felt almost like a dance, moving between telescope and chalkboard and star charts with an ease born of growing familiarity, their hands brushing as they reached for the same calculation or pointed to the same celestial coordinate, small touches that sent awareness singing through Arabella's nerves, even as she pretended not to notice. The progression of seasons from late summer warmth into autumn chill changed the atmosphere in the observatory, requiring them to stand closer together at the telescope to conserve the heat from the small stove in the corner. And Arabella became acutely conscious of Sebastian's physical presence in ways that had nothing to do with astronomy, the scent of his cologne mixing with the familiar smells of brass polish and old paper, the sound of his breathing when he leaned close to examine a calculation she had made, the warmth of his body when they stood side by side, looking through the telescope at the same quadrant of sky. She learned that he had studied at Cambridge under the Astronomer Royal, that he had built his own advanced observatory at Hartfield because the stars interested him more than ballrooms ever could, that his scientific pursuits were tolerated by society as aristocratic eccentricity, but never truly respected because gentlemen were expected to manage estates and attend Parliament rather than spend their nights mapping celestial movements. He spoke with quiet bitterness about the loneliness of pursuing knowledge in a world that valued social performance over intellectual achievement, about attending dinner parties where he must pretend interest in gossip and politics when all he wanted was to discuss the latest astronomical observations from Greenwich. And Arabella understood that loneliness in her bones because she had lived it from the other direction, isolated not by a title that elevated her above serious conversation, but by a gender that excluded her from it entirely. She found herself sharing fears she had never spoken aloud, confessing one evening as they worked late that she worried her father's legacy would die with her, that his decades of careful observation and his dream of advancing astronomical knowledge would be dismissed because his daughter had proven too female and too foolish to carry his work forward into recognition. Sebastian had stopped his calculations and turned to look at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, telling her that her father's legacy lived in every calculation she made, in every observation she recorded, in the brilliant mind he had nurtured and encouraged against all social convention, and that any man who had raised a daughter to pursue truth with such passion and precision had already achieved immortality through her regardless of what the Royal Society or Edmund Tilney or any other small-minded fool might think. The words had brought tears to her eyes, that she blinked away furiously because crying was the kind of emotional display that confirmed every prejudice about female unsuitability for science. But Sebastian had seen them anyway, and his expression had softened into something tender that made her heart beat faster, and her hands tremble as she turned back to her calculations with studied concentration. The meteor shower came on a clear November night, when the air held the sharp bite of approaching winter and the sky stretched overhead like black velvet scattered with diamonds. And they had been tracking the Leonid meteors for 2 hours, recording the frequency and trajectories with the same precision they applied to all their observations, when Sebastian suddenly abandoned his notebook and turned from the telescope to look at Arabella instead of the sky. She was bent over her own notes, her face illuminated by lamplight that turned her skin golden and caught the dark strands of hair that had escaped her careful arrangement, and she was so absorbed in her work that she did not notice his attention until he spoke her name in a voice that carried none of the formality he usually maintained. "You are more luminous than any celestial body, Arabella," he said, and the use of her given name without the protective Miss made her look up in surprise to find him watching her with an expression that could not be mistaken for mere collegial admiration, something raw and hungry and tender that made her abandon her notebook and turn toward him with her heart suddenly pounding in her throat. "Your Grace," she began breathlessly, uncertain what she intended to say, but needing to acknowledge what she saw in his face, needing to understand if the connection she felt between them existed anywhere beyond her own foolish imagination. But before she could form the words, he stepped back abruptly, his expression shuddering, as formality reasserted itself like armor against whatever had been building between them. "Forgive me," he said, his voice tight with restraint that cost him visible effort. "That was inappropriate, and I should not have spoken so. We are colleagues and scientific partners, and I should not have allowed myself to forget the boundaries that must govern our association." The words struck like physical blows, each one a rejection of what Arabella had let herself begin to hope might be growing between them, and she forced herself to match his retreat into formality, even as something inside her chest cracked and bled. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. The meteors are quite spectacular tonight, and we should continue recording their frequency if we hope to publish findings that will be taken seriously." They returned to their observations with the awkwardness of two people pretending nothing had happened. The comfortable intimacy that had developed over 2 months suddenly fractured by words spoken and withdrawn, and when Sebastian prepared to leave that evening, the silence between them felt thick with everything they were not saying. He gathered his notes and pulled on his coat with jerky movements that lacked his usual grace, and Arabella walked him to the observatory door because politeness demanded it, even though she wanted nothing more than to retreat to her room and examine the wreckage of hopes she should never have allowed herself to entertain. "Why do you come here?" she heard herself ask as he paused at the top of the spiral stairs, the question emerging unbidden from some place inside her that needed to understand even if the answer would hurt. "Truly, Your Grace, you have superior equipment at Hartfield and access to observations from Greenwich. You do not need my data or my calculations, so why do you ride 20 miles twice weekly to work in this obsolete observatory?" Sebastian turned to face her in the narrow doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light that filtered up from the floor below, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, but carried an intensity that made her breath stop. "Perhaps I do not come for the observations, Miss Fairfax," he said, each word emerging with careful precision, as though he was confessing something dangerous that could not be taken back once spoken. "Perhaps I come because in this observatory I am not a duke who must perform propriety and maintain dignity and marry appropriately to produce heirs. I am simply a man who loves the stars, speaking with a woman who understands them better than anyone I have ever met. A woman whose mind is as beautiful as her face, and whose passion for knowledge makes every other conversation feel empty and meaningless by comparison." The confession hung between them in the cold November air, too honest to be mistaken for mere flattery, but too constrained by his immediate withdrawal to be acted upon, and Arabella understood with painful clarity that Sebastian felt the same attraction she did, but had decided for reasons of honor or propriety, or his own fears, that it could not be acknowledged or pursued. She wanted to tell him that she did not care about his title, that she would happily be a colleague and nothing more if that was what he needed. But the words stuck in her throat because they would be lies, and she had built her life on truth, even when truth was uncomfortable. So instead she simply nodded and stepped back to let him pass, listening to his footsteps descend the spiral stairs, while she remained in the doorway trying to understand how scientific collaboration had transformed into something that felt like heartbreak. Lady Beatrice said nothing when Arabella finally descended to the main house and retired to her room earlier than usual, but her knowing eyes and gentle pat on her niece's hand suggested she understood more than Arabella had wanted anyone to perceive, that the twice-weekly visits from the Duke of Hartfield had become something more significant than astronomical collaboration, and that her brilliant niece, who had never shown interest in any of the men who had courted her over the years, was now suffering from an affliction that no amount of scientific observation could cure or mathematical calculation predict. That night, Arabella lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince herself that gratitude for Sebastian's intellectual respect had been mistaken for deeper feelings, that the warmth she felt when he smiled at something she said was merely the pleasure of being taken seriously after years of dismissal, that the way her heart raced when their hands touched over. Star charts was simply the excitement of collaborative discovery, but she could not make herself believe the lies, even as she whispered them in the darkness. She had fallen in love with Sebastian Wentworth somewhere between their first chalkboard debate and tonight's meteor shower, had fallen for his brilliant mind and his gentle respect and his passion for knowledge that matched her own, and the tragedy was that he seemed to feel something similar, but had convinced himself that his position as a duke made him unsuitable for a partnership with a woman the world had already dismissed as a foolish spinster playing at science, as though the very title and wealth that made him desirable to every unmarried woman in England somehow disqualified him from loving the one woman who valued his mind more than his estate. The calculations were complete and perfect. 3 months of combined work that definitively proved the existence of the planet beyond Saturn with mathematical precision that could not be dismissed even by the most prejudiced minds. And Arabella stood in the observatory, holding the final pages with hands that trembled not from nervousness but from triumph, because she and Sebastian had agreed to present their findings jointly at the next Royal Society meeting, his name and title lending credibility that would force the assembled gentlemen to actually examine the work before passing judgment. She had not seen Sebastian for 3 days because he had remained in London to arrange the presentation and ensure that the Society would grant them sufficient time to demonstrate their calculations properly, and in his absence Arabella had been hosting her cousin, Lydia Fairfax, who had arrived from Bath a week earlier for what was supposed to be a month-long visit, but which had already begun to feel interminable due to the girl's constant complaints about the dullness of country life and her pointed observations about how unnatural it was for a woman of 28 to receive such frequent visits from an unmarried duke. Lydia was 21 and pretty in the conventional way that society valued, with golden curls and blue eyes and a figure that required no padding in her fashionable gowns, and she had been raised by Arabella's uncle to believe that her primary purpose in life was to secure an advantageous marriage, which made her view Arabella's astronomical pursuits with a mixture of pity and contempt that she did not bother to hide during their uncomfortable dinners together. Lady Beatrice had noticed the tension and tried to keep Lydia occupied with social calls to neighbouring families, but the girl seemed determined to spend her time examining everything in Fairfax Manor, with calculating eyes that lingered too long on the valuable items, and particularly on the observatory tower that Arabella had foolishly mentioned was where she and the Duke conducted their scientific work. The theft happened on a grey November afternoon when rain drummed against the dome with relentless percussion that matched the growing anxiety in Arabella's chest, though she did not yet know the source of her unease, only that something felt wrong in a way she could not articulate as she climbed the spiral stairs to check on her calculations one more time before Sebastian's return from London. The door to the observatory stood slightly ajar, though she distinctly remembered closing it that morning, and when she pushed it open, she found papers scattered across the floor where someone had clearly searched through her carefully organized work, star charts displaced from their usual positions, and her father's notebooks moved from their shelves as though someone unfamiliar with the space had been looking for something specific without knowing exactly where to find it. Her heart began to pound as she rushed to the locked drawer where she kept the final calculations, the culmination of 3 months of collaboration that represented both professional vindication and the closest thing to a love letter she and Sebastian had managed to create, pages covered in their combined handwriting and mathematical proofs that told the story of their partnership more clearly than any words could have done. The drawer hung open and empty, the lock forced with something thin and metal that had left scratches on the brass mechanism, and Arabella felt the world tilt sideways as she understood what had happened and who must have done it, because only Lydia had been in the house during her morning ride. Only Lydia had shown such persistent interest in the observatory, despite claiming to find astronomical pursuits tedious and unfeminine. Only Lydia had the combination of access and motive, though Arabella could not yet understand what that motive might be beyond the general malice that seemed to drive her cousin's every action. She found Lydia in her room packing her trunk with hasty movements that spoke of guilty flight, and when the girl looked up to see Arabella standing in the doorway, her pretty face flushed with colour that might have been shame, but looked more like irritation at being interrupted. "Where are my calculations?" Arabella asked, keeping her voice level despite the rage and betrayal churning in her stomach. "The papers from the locked drawer in my observatory. I know you took them, Lydia, and I want them returned immediately." Lydia lifted her chin with defiance that would have been impressive if it had been attached to any principle beyond selfishness. "I do not know what you mean," she said, but her eyes slid away from Arabella's face in a way that confirmed her guilt more clearly than any confession. I have been packing for my departure because I received an urgent letter from Papa requiring my return to Bath, and I resent the implication that I would have any interest in your dusty astronomical papers." The lie was so transparent that Arabella felt almost insulted by its lack of sophistication, and she stepped into the room with her hands clenched at her sides to keep from shaking her cousin until the truth spilled out. "I saw you coming down from the observatory tower this morning," she said, her voice cold with the kind of fury that burned through shock into something harder and more dangerous, "and the lock on my drawer has been forced, so you can either return my calculations now, or I will send for the magistrate and have you charged with theft." Lydia's defiance crumbled under the threat, her face crumpling into tears that might have moved Arabella if she had not been so far beyond caring about her cousin's distress. "I did not think you would actually mind," Lydia wailed, her voice taking on the petulant tone of a child caught misbehaving. "You are a spinster, Arabella, and what do you need scientific recognition for when you will never marry and never have a real life? Lord Tilney can actually use this work, and he promised he would mention that you assisted him, which is more credit than most men would give." The words hit Arabella like ice water, each syllable revealing layers of betrayal she had not imagined in her worst nightmares, and she understood suddenly that this was not simple jealousy or malicious mischief, but a calculated theft orchestrated by Edmund Tilney, who had used Lydia's vanity and resentment as tools to steal the work that would have vindicated everything Arabella had sacrificed for astronomical study. "Lord Tilney," she repeated slowly, her mind racing through. "Implications and consequences. You gave my calculations to Edmund Tilney, the man who publicly humiliated me at the Royal Society and called my work the fanciful imaginings of a foolish spinster." Lydia had the grace to look uncomfortable, but rallied with the self-justification of someone determined to believe her own excuses. "He has been very attentive to me in London," she said, "and he explained how your obsession with astronomy was unnatural, and how the Duke's interest in you was clearly charity rather than genuine regard. And when he learned that you and His Grace were working together, he said it was his duty to protect the Society from further embarrassment by ensuring the work was presented properly by someone qualified." She paused, then added with a spite that cut deeper than the rest, "And anyway, you are 8 years older than me, Arabella, and he looks at you like you hung the moon, which is unnatural and wrong when you should be grateful anyone pays you attention at all. So I do not see why you are making such a fuss when Lord Tilney offering to present your work is more than you deserve." Arabella stared at her cousin, feeling something cold and final settle in her chest, all the complicated bonds of family obligation dissolving under the weight of this betrayal that encompassed not just theft, but a fundamental misunderstanding of everything she valued and everything she had worked to achieve. "Get out of my house," she said quietly, each word distinct and hard as stones. "Take your trunk and leave Fairfax Manor immediately, and do not return because you are no longer welcome here." Lydia opened her mouth to argue, but something in Arabella's expression made her reconsider, and she grabbed her partially packed trunk and fled the room with tears streaming down her pretty face. But Arabella had no sympathy left for a girl who had sold her work to the man who had already destroyed her professional reputation once and was apparently prepared to do it again. She returned to the observatory and sank into her father's old chair, surrounded by the scattered papers and violated space, trying to understand the full dimensions of what had been stolen and what it would mean when Edmund presented her calculations as his own discovery to a royal society that had no reason to doubt his word over hers. The rain continued its assault on the dome, creating a sound like grief made audible, and the telescope pointed at empty sky through glass streaked with water that distorted whatever stars might have been visible beyond the clouds. And Arabella sat in the gathering darkness, feeling everything she had rebuilt over the past 3 months crumble into ruins that might be beyond any repair. She was still sitting there when Sebastian arrived hours later, his horse lathered from hard riding and his face showing the kind of fury she had never seen in his usually controlled features. And she understood before he spoke that he had heard what Edmund had done, that the theft had already borne its poisoned fruit in London while she sat paralyzed in her father's observatory, trying to comprehend the scope of her cousin's betrayal. He called an emergency session of the Royal Society. Sebastian said without preamble, his voice shaking with rage barely contained. Edmund Tilney claimed he had made a breakthrough in calculating the orbit of a new planet beyond Saturn, and the Society granted him a special presentation this afternoon, and he stood where you should have stood, Arabella, and presented your calculations as his own work, while the assembled gentlemen celebrated his genius and talked about nominating him for awards. The words should have hurt more than they did, but Arabella found she had moved beyond pain into a numb resignation that felt almost like peace, the kind of acceptance that comes when your worst fears are confirmed and you can stop dreading them and simply acknowledge reality. "I know," she said tiredly. "Lydia stole the calculations and gave them to Edmund. She admitted everything before I sent her away. Apparently he has been courting her in London and convinced her that a spinster like me has no need for scientific recognition when I will never marry or have what she calls a real life." Sebastian crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his hands gripping the armrests on either side of her, as though he needed physical support against what he was about to say. "I will go to the Society tomorrow," he said urgently. "I will tell them the truth and bring evidence of your work. I have letters we exchanged with calculations in your hand, and I witnessed every step of your process. I will make them understand that Edmund stole your work and force them to give you the credit you deserve." Arabella looked at his face so close to hers and saw the desperation there, the need to fix what had been broken and protect what he valued. But she also saw with painful clarity how any such defense would be interpreted by a society that already doubted her credibility and viewed his support with suspicion. "And they will say you are a lovesick duke defending his mistress's honor," she said gently, touching his face with a tenderness she had never allowed herself before, because nothing mattered anymore when everything had already been lost. The scandal will destroy us both, and Edmund will still be celebrated because he has already rewritten the calculations in his own hand and claimed them as his independent discovery. And even if you convince some members of the Society to doubt him, enough will believe his version to ensure that my name remains associated with scandal rather than science. Sebastian jerked back as though she had struck him, his eyes widening with hurt that she had used that particular word. "Mistress," he repeated, and she could hear in his voice all the things they had never said to each other during 3 months of careful collaboration. "Arabella, you cannot think that I regard you as anything so dishonorable, or that my defense of your work stems from anything other than recognition of your brilliance." She felt tears beginning to fall for the first time since discovering the theft, grief finally breaking through the numb shock because his hurt somehow mattered more than Edmund's triumph or Lydia's betrayal or the loss of work that had consumed 3 years of her life. "I think you should return to Hartfield." "Your Grace," she said, forcing the words out past the tightness in her throat. "Our collaboration is ended, and there is no purpose in you continuing to associate yourself with a woman who has been twice publicly dismissed by the Royal Society. Edmund has won as men like him always do because the world is arranged to ensure their victories. And I will not allow you to sacrifice your reputation trying to defend mine when such defense is both futile and likely to be misinterpreted in ways that would harm us both." Sebastian stood abruptly and began pacing the observatory with the restless energy of a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists and his face showing the internal battle between honor that demanded he fight and pragmatism that acknowledged the truth of her words. "This cannot be how it ends," he said. 3 months of work and discovery and partnership cannot simply be stolen by a man too small-minded to recognize brilliance when it stands before him offering truth. There must be some recourse or appeal or way to prove that the work was yours. Arabella watched him pace and felt her heart breaking in new ways that had nothing to do with stolen calculations and everything to do with the man before her who still believed that truth and justice could prevail against prejudice and power. "There is no proof that would satisfy them," she said quietly. "Edmund has the calculations in his own handwriting now, and I have only my word against his, and we both know whose word the Royal Society will credit, the respected Viscount, who has been a member for years, or the foolish spinster who already embarrassed herself once by presuming to present astronomical work beyond her capacity." She paused, then added the thing that needed to be said even though it would drive him away forever. "And your defense of me will only confirm their worst suspicions about why you spent so much time at Fairfax Manor. They will say you were either taken in by feminine manipulation or engaged in an affair that clouded your scientific judgment, and either interpretation will destroy any credibility my work might have had while damaging your own reputation in ways that could affect your position and influence for years to come." Sebastian stopped pacing and turned to face her with an expression that combined anguish and determination in equal measure. "I do not care about my reputation if it means abandoning you to this injustice," he said. "And if society chooses to believe I am a fool or a libertine for defending the finest scientific mind I have ever encountered, then society can go to hell and take Edmund Tilney with it." The words warmed something in Arabella's frozen chest, but could not change the reality they faced, and she stood from her father's chair and crossed to where Sebastian stood, with rain still hammering the dome above them and darkness gathering in corners the lamplight could not reach. "You should care about your reputation because you have important work to do and influence that can advance astronomical research in ways I never could," she said. "And I will not be the reason you lose that influence or become an object of scandal and mockery. So please, Your Grace, do me the kindness of leaving before I say things that will make this parting even more difficult than it already is." She saw him start to argue and raised her hand to stop him, her vision blurring with tears that finally overflowed to trace hot paths down her cold cheeks. "Edmund has won," she said, her voice breaking on the words she had been trying not to speak. "This is what I feared from the beginning, and perhaps I should have expected no different. A woman's work will always be claimed by men who have the power to make such claims credible, and our collaboration was beautiful while it lasted. But it is ended now, and continuing it will only bring pain and scandal to us both." Sebastian reached for her but stopped himself, his hands falling back to his sides in defeat that looked physical, and when he spoke his voice carried a grief that matched her own. "You are making a mistake," he said softly. "Sending me away will not protect you from further harm, and it will not restore what Edmund has stolen. It will only ensure that you face this injustice alone when you should have someone standing beside you who understands what has been lost." Arabella closed her eyes against the sight of him standing in her father's observatory, looking like everything she had never known she wanted until it was too late, and she gathered the tattered remains of her pride to speak the final dismissal. "Please go," she whispered. "Just go and let me grieve in private for what might have been if the world were different, or I were born a man, or any of 1,000 other impossibilities that will never come to pass. And please do not make this harder by staying when we both know there is nothing more to be said or done." She heard his footsteps cross the floor and pause at the doorway, heard him draw breath as though to speak, and then release it in defeat, and then the sound of his boots on the spiral stairs descending into silence, while she stood alone in the violated observatory with rain against the dome and darkness pressing in from all sides, and the certain knowledge that she had lost not just her calculations and her professional vindication, but also the partnership, and perhaps the love that had made the past 3 months feel like living in a world where women's minds could be valued and respected and celebrated rather than dismissed and stolen and claimed by lesser men who happened to be born, with the right gender and the wrong ethics. 2 weeks had passed since Arabella had sent Sebastian away, and in that time she had returned every letter he sent unopened, each one arriving with his ducal seal intact, and each one placed in the drawer of her writing desk, where she would not have to look at them or think about what words might be written inside, because thinking about Sebastian meant remembering everything she had lost and everything she had been foolish enough to hope for during 3 months of collaboration that now felt like a beautiful dream from which she had been violently awakened. She spent those weeks dismantling her father's observatory with methodical precision that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, wrapping each brass instrument in cloth before placing it carefully in wooden crates that would travel with her to Bath, where Lady Beatrice had a small house and an extra bedroom, and no expectations that her niece would ever accomplish anything beyond quiet spinsterhood among the invalids and widows who populated that city of retirement and resignation. The telescope was the last thing she would pack, because she could not quite bring herself to dismantle the instrument through which she had observed the perturbations that led to her calculations, through which she and Sebastian had witnessed meteor showers and tracked the movement of Jupiter's moons, and shared moments of discovery that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with two minds finding perfect synchronization in the pursuit of knowledge that transcended all the social barriers meant to keep them separate. The November afternoon was grey and cold, autumn leaves falling past the observatory windows in shades of brown and gold that reminded her of decay and endings, and she was carefully removing her father's notebooks from their shelves when Lady Beatrice appeared at the top of the spiral stairs with an expression that combined excitement and something like trepidation. "My dear," her aunt said breathlessly, "there are visitors downstairs requesting to see you, gentlemen from France who say they have travelled specifically to meet you and discuss your astronomical work, and they are accompanied by the Duke of Hartfield, who insists that you will want to hear what they have to say." Arabella felt her heart clench at the mention of Sebastian's name, but shook her head firmly because she had made her decision and could not afford to weaken now when weakness would only prolong the pain of separation. "Please tell His Grace that I am not receiving visitors, and ask him to convey my apologies to his French friends, but I have nothing to discuss regarding astronomical work that has already been claimed by another and celebrated by a society that will never acknowledge my contributions regardless of what evidence might be presented." Lady Beatrice crossed the observatory and took both of Arabella's hands in her own with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a young woman of 60 years. "My darling girl," she said gently, "I think you should at least hear what they have come to say, because the Duke looks like a man who has moved heaven and earth for some purpose, and these French gentlemen did not travel from Paris simply to deliver condolences on work that was stolen, so please come downstairs and listen before you make any final decisions about what can or cannot be salvaged from this disaster." Arabella wanted to refuse, but something in her aunt's expression made her reconsider, and she followed Lady Beatrice down the spiral stairs with her heart beating too fast and her hands trembling inside the pockets of her simple day dress that was streaked with dust from packing and entirely inappropriate for receiving aristocratic visitors or foreign delegations. The drawing room held 4 men who all turned when she entered, and she recognized Sebastian immediately, despite 2 weeks of trying to forget the exact shade of his eyes and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. But the 3 other gentlemen were strangers dressed in formal attire that suggested official capacity rather than social calling, and they bowed with a respect that seemed oddly sincere for men addressing a disgraced spinster astronomer. Sebastian stepped forward, and she saw in his face a combination of triumph and tenderness that made her breath catch. But before he could speak, one of the French gentlemen moved to intercept him with the smooth diplomacy of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations. "Mademoiselle Fairfax," the Frenchman said in accented but excellent English, "I am Dr. Henri Moreau, representing the French Academy of Sciences, and it is my very great honor to meet you at last. Your calculations are the most precise astronomical predictions we have seen in a generation, and the Academy would be honored if you would accept our invitation to present your findings in Paris, where we have much to learn from your methodology and observations." Arabella stared at him in confusion that bordered on incomprehension, certain she must have misheard or misunderstood, because nothing he said made sense in a world where Edmund Tilney had stolen her work and presented it as his own to the acclaim of England's scientific establishment. "I do not understand," she said slowly, her voice emerging hoarse from disuse and emotion. "Lord Tilney presented this work as his own discovery to the Royal Society just 2 weeks ago, and they celebrated his achievement. So how can the French Academy be discussing my calculations as though they were acknowledged as mine?" Dr. Moreau exchanged glances with his companions before producing a leather portfolio that he opened to reveal printed pages in French that she could not read without closer examination, but she recognized the mathematical equations and star charts that had been reproduced with careful accuracy. "The Duke of Hartfield contacted us 1 month ago," Dr. Moreau explained, "sending copies of your original calculations along with his own corroborating observations and a rather impassioned letter explaining that the English Royal Society had dismissed work of extraordinary merit due to prejudices that have no place in serious scientific inquiry, and the Academy took the unusual step of conducting independent verification of your predictions using our observatory facilities in Paris." He paused, then smiled with genuine warmth that transformed his formal features into something almost paternal. "Mademoiselle, we pointed our telescopes at the precise coordinates you calculated, and we found your planet exactly where your mathematics predicted it would be. The orbital mechanics are precisely as you described, and the gravitational perturbations match your theoretical framework with such accuracy that several of our senior astronomers are now revising their own work based on your methodology." Arabella felt the room tilt sideways as the meaning of his words penetrated the fog of confusion and disbelief that had surrounded her since entering the drawing room, and she reached for the back of a chair to steady herself because her legs suddenly seemed unable to support her weight. "You found the planet," she repeated, needing to hear herself say the words to believe they were real. "You used my calculations, and you found it." The second French gentleman stepped forward and bowed with the kind of respect usually reserved for established scientific authorities rather than dismissed female amateurs. "Not only did we find it, Mademoiselle Fairfax," he said, "but we have published our findings in the Academy's official journal crediting the groundbreaking work of Miss Arabella Fairfax of England, whose calculations proved extraordinarily precise and whose theoretical framework represents a significant advancement in our understanding of celestial mechanics, and I am pleased to inform you that observatories in Berlin and Vienna have now confirmed our observations using your predicted coordinates." Arabella turned to look at Sebastian, who had remained silent during the French astronomer's explanations, and she saw in his face the answer to questions she had not yet learned to ask. Understanding flooding through her that he had done this, that he had used his aristocratic connections and his own scientific credibility to bypass the English prejudice that had twice dismissed her work, that he had gone to the international community and presented her calculations as worthy of serious examination, regardless of the gender of their author. "You did this," she said, her voice breaking as tears began to stream down her face unchecked. "After I sent you away and returned your letters unopened, you went to the international astronomical community and gave them my work." Sebastian crossed the room to stand before her, though he did not reach out to touch her, despite the obvious desire in his eyes to offer physical comfort. "I did what any man of honor would do," he said quietly. "I ensured the truth was known and that your work received the recognition it deserved. Your discoveries and your legacy belong to you alone, Arabella, and no amount of Edmund Tilney's theft or the Royal Society's prejudice could change the mathematical reality that your calculations were correct and your methodology was sound." The third French gentleman cleared his throat delicately and produced another document from his portfolio, this one bearing official seals and signatures that suggested institutional authority. "There is one more matter, Mademoiselle Fairfax," he said. "The International Astronomical Union has reviewed the evidence presented by the French Academy and confirmed by observatories across Europe, and they have made the decision to officially designate this newly confirmed celestial body as Arabella in honor of its discoverer, whose work represents the kind of rigorous scientific inquiry that advances human knowledge regardless of the nationality or gender of the researcher. Arabella felt her knees give way and would have fallen if Sebastian had not moved quickly to catch her, his arms coming around her waist to support her weight, while she tried to process words that seemed impossible, that belonged to some other woman's life rather than her own. "They named a planet after me," she whispered against Sebastian's shoulder, aware that the French delegation was watching, but unable to care about propriety when the world had just shifted on its axis in ways that defied all her expectations. "This cannot be real. None of this can be real, because 2 weeks ago Edmund was being celebrated for stealing my work, and now you are telling me that France and Germany and Vienna have confirmed my calculations and named a planet Arabella." Dr. Moreau smiled with the satisfaction of someone delivering news he knows will be appreciated. "It is very real, mademoiselle," he assured her, "and I should mention that the publication of our findings has created what the English newspapers are calling a scandal. The Royal Society is facing considerable embarrassment that they ignored and mocked work that has brought international acclaim to an English woman, and there are questions being raised about Lord Tilney's derivative calculations, which we found contained several significant errors that suggest he copied your work without truly understanding the underlying mathematics." Sebastian's arms tightened around her briefly before he seemed to remember they had an audience and stepped back, though his hands remained on her shoulders as though he could not quite bear to completely release her. "The international community has examined both sets of calculations," he said. "Lord Tilney's were derivative and contained errors in the third and fifth assumptions that would have led to incorrect predictions of the planet's position. Yours were original and mathematically sound, and the fact that 3 separate observatories found the planet exactly where you predicted demonstrates that the truth speaks for itself regardless of who tries to claim credit." Arabella looked up at Sebastian's face and saw there everything she had been too frightened to hope for during their 3 months of collaboration: love and respect and admiration, combined with a determination to ensure her work received recognition, even if it cost him his own reputation or standing in English society. "Why?" she asked, knowing the French delegation could hear, but needing to understand before her heart could accept what her mind was struggling to believe. "After I sent you away and refused your letters and told you our collaboration was ended, why would you fight for me when, doing so, risked associating yourself with scandal and controversy?" Sebastian's hands moved from her shoulders to cup her face with a tenderness that made her breath stop, his thumbs brushing away tears that continued to fall, despite her efforts to control them. "Because I love you," he said simply, each word clear and deliberate, as though he was making a vow that could not be taken back or qualified, not as a scientific colleague or an intellectual curiosity, but as a man loves a woman he wishes to spend his life beside. "I love your brilliant mind and your passion for truth, and your courage in pursuing knowledge despite every obstacle society places in your path. And even if you can never return that feeling, I could not stand by and watch your brilliance be buried by lesser men who lack the honor to acknowledge work that surpasses their own capabilities." The French scientists had tactfully moved to the far side of the drawing room, where they stood examining Lady Beatrice's collection of botanical prints with exaggerated interest that suggested they were pretending not to hear a declaration of love that was being made in their presence, and Arabella was grateful for their discretion, even as she found she did not care who witnessed this moment, because Sebastian had just spoken aloud the words she had been afraid to even think during 2 weeks of dismantling her father's observatory and preparing to abandon the scientific work that had defined her life. "I love you too," she whispered, the confession emerging with the kind of relief that comes from finally speaking a truth that has been suppressed too long. "I have loved you since somewhere in the middle of our collaboration, when I realized you valued my mind as much as I valued yours, and that working beside you felt like coming home to a place I had been seeking without knowing it existed, and I sent you away because I thought protecting your reputation mattered more than acknowledging what we felt, but I have been miserable every moment since." Sebastian smiled with a joy that transformed his usually controlled features into something radiant, and he leaned down to rest his forehead against hers in a gesture of intimacy that would have been scandalous if anyone had been watching, but which felt perfectly natural in the drawing room of Fairfax Manor, surrounded by French astronomers and botanical prints, and the wreckage of everything Arabella had thought she understood about what her life could hold. "The planet Arabella," he said softly, "is permanent and undeniable proof that your work matters, and that no amount of prejudice or theft can erase the contributions you have made to astronomical science. And if you will consent to marry me, I promise you a partnership of equals where your research will never again be dismissed or stolen, and where we can spend our lives advancing knowledge together." Arabella pulled back just enough to see his face clearly, needing to be certain she understood what he was offering and what it would mean. "You want to marry a woman who has been twice dismissed by the Royal Society," she said, "a spinster astronomer who will never be content with drawing rooms and social calls when there are calculations to be made and observations to be recorded." Sebastian laughed with genuine amusement that echoed in the high-ceilinged room and drew the attention of the French delegation, who smiled indulgently at the couple who had apparently forgotten their presence. "I want to marry the woman who discovered a planet and whose mathematical framework is being studied by astronomers across Europe," he said, "and I promise that our home at Hartfield will include the finest observatory in England, with equipment specifically designed to support your research, and that I will spend the rest of my life ensuring the world knows your name and respects your contributions to science." Dr. Moreau cleared his throat delicately and approached with the kind of diplomatic timing that suggested he had been waiting for an appropriate moment to interrupt. "Mademoiselle Fairfax," he said, "the French Academy's invitation to present your work in Paris stands regardless of any other considerations, and we hope you will accept because there are many young women in France who wish to pursue scientific study but lack examples of female achievement to inspire them. Your work and your recognition could change what is possible for the next generation." Arabella looked from Sebastian to the French delegation to her aunt, who stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face and a smile that suggested she had been hoping for exactly this outcome, and she understood that everything had changed in the space of an afternoon, that the planet bearing her name was permanent proof that a woman's work could be recognized and celebrated, and that love did not require choosing between intellectual partnership and romantic fulfillment when you found someone who valued both equally. "I accept," she said, and the words applied to both the French Academy's invitation and Sebastian's proposal, and the future that had suddenly opened before her like the night sky revealing stars that had always been there waiting to be observed and understood and celebrated for the wonders they represented. The invitation from the Royal Society, arrived 3 weeks after the French Academy's publication, created what the London newspapers were calling the astronomical scandal of the decade, and the formal language could not quite hide the institutional embarrassment that had prompted this unprecedented reversal, requesting that Miss Arabella Fairfax present her findings regarding the newly confirmed planet to a special session of the Society where her work could receive the recognition it deserved from England's premier scientific institution. Arabella read the letter twice in the drawing room at Fairfax Manor, where she and Sebastian had been planning their wedding and her upcoming presentation in Paris, and she felt a grim satisfaction that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with vindication, because the same men who had laughed at her humiliation 3 months earlier were now falling over themselves to associate with work that had brought international acclaim to an English woman they had been too prejudiced to take seriously. Sebastian stood behind her chair, reading over her shoulder, and she felt his hands tighten on her shoulders when he reached the part where the society mentioned that Viscount Edmund Tilney had been asked to resign his membership after the French Academy published a detailed comparison demonstrating that his calculations were derivative copies containing mathematical errors that proved he had not understood the work he claimed as his own. "He is ruined," Sebastian said quietly, his voice carrying satisfaction that matched her own. "The society has revoked his membership, and his reputation in scientific circles is destroyed, and I heard from a friend at court that even his social standing has suffered because stealing a woman's work is apparently considered ungentlemanly, even by people who would never have credited that work if it had been presented under your name." Arabella leaned back against him and considered the invitation that represented both triumph and a return to the scene of her greatest humiliation, the same lecture hall where Edmund had mocked her and where masculine laughter had echoed off vaulted ceilings while her dreams crumbled into dust. "I want to accept," she said, "not because I need their approval anymore, but because I want to stand in that hall as the discoverer of planet Arabella and show every man who laughed that they were wrong to dismiss work based on the gender of its author rather than the quality of its mathematics." The day of her presentation arrived cold and bright in early December, London streets covered in frost that crunched under carriage wheels as Arabella and Sebastian travelled to the Royal Society building that loomed against a pale winter sky like a monument to masculine authority that was about to be challenged in ways its founders had never imagined. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that Lady Beatrice had insisted was appropriate for such an important occasion, her hair arranged in an elegant style that suggested confidence rather than the desperate attempt at propriety that had characterized her appearance 3 months earlier, and she carried her charts and calculations in a leather portfolio that Sebastian had given her as an engagement present, engraved with her name and the words astronomer and discoverer in Latin that transformed her amateur status into professional recognition. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity with every seat filled and men standing along the walls, but the composition of the audience had changed dramatically from her first presentation because now journalists occupied the front rows with notebooks ready to document whatever happened, and several women sat among the crowd, including Lady Beatrice and 2 female scientists from France who had travelled specifically to witness this moment. The atmosphere hummed with anticipation that felt different from the skeptical judgment she had faced before, as though the international recognition had transformed her from an object of mockery into a curiosity worth examining, and she saw in many faces a grudging respect that had been entirely absent during her previous appearance. Edmund Tilney sat in the back corner looking diminished and bitter, his handsome features drawn with the kind of desperation that comes from watching a carefully constructed reputation collapse under the weight of exposed dishonesty. And when their eyes met across the crowded room, she saw in his face hatred mixed with fear because he understood that her triumph was his final defeat. Arabella took her position at the lectern where she had stood 3 months ago with trembling hands and breaking voice, but now she placed her portfolio down with steady confidence and looked out at the assembled crowd with the calm authority of someone who knows. Her work has already been vindicated by authorities more credible than those present. She began her presentation without preamble or apology, diving directly into the mathematical framework that had led to her discovery, and her voice carried clearly through the hall as she explained the perturbations she had observed and the calculations that had predicted the existence and location of the planet that now bore her name. The audience listened with attention that verged on reverence, taking notes and nodding at particularly elegant mathematical solutions, and she found herself enjoying the presentation in a way she had not been able to during her first attempt because she was no longer seeking approval, but simply sharing knowledge that had already been recognized as valuable by people whose opinions actually mattered. She was midway through explaining the orbital mechanics when Edmund stood abruptly, his voice cutting across her explanation with the sharp edge of a man who has nothing left to lose and is determined to inflict whatever damage remains possible. "The society must ask," he said loudly enough to be heard throughout the hall, whether Miss Fairfax truly conducted this work alone, or whether the Duke of Hartfield, known for his own astronomical pursuits, provided rather more than collegial support in developing calculations that seem remarkably sophisticated for a woman with no formal training or institutional affiliation. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, heads turning to look at Sebastian, who sat in the third row with an expression that had gone dangerously still. And Arabella felt her heart begin to race, because Edmund's insinuation was clear, even if his words remained superficially about scientific collaboration rather than romantic impropriety. Before she could formulate a response that would defend both her work and her reputation, Sebastian rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a man completely confident in his right to command attention, and when he spoke, his voice carried with the kind of authority that made every other sound in the hall fall silent. "You are correct, Lord Tilney," he said, his words pitched to reach every corner of the room, "that I have been intimately involved with Miss Fairfax's work these past months, and witnessed the development of her calculations from initial observations through final mathematical proofs." Gasps echoed through the hall, and Arabella felt the blood drain from her face, because Sebastian's confirmation of Edmund's insinuation seemed designed to destroy rather than defend her credibility. But then he continued speaking, and she understood the strategy behind words that had initially seemed like betrayal. "I have had the extraordinary privilege," Sebastian said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled scientists and journalists and society members, who hung on his every word, of witnessing a mind more brilliant than any I have encountered in 20 years of astronomical study, beginning at Cambridge under the Astronomer Royal and continuing through my own research at observatories across Europe. He paused, letting the weight of his credentials establish his authority to judge scientific merit. "I have watched Miss Fairfax solve problems that baffled me," he continued, his voice warming with genuine admiration that could not be mistaken for mere gallantry. "I have seen her make intuitive leaps in mathematical reasoning that took my breath away, and I have struggled to keep pace with calculations that she produced with an elegance and precision that would be remarkable in any scientist, regardless of training or institutional affiliation." Another pause as he let that sink in. Then he added, with quiet emphasis, "And yes, I have provided support to her work by staying out of her way and learning from her genius, rather than presuming that my formal education gave me superiority over her natural brilliance and years of dedicated observation." The hall had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on Sebastian, who now turned from addressing the audience to look directly at Arabella, standing at the lectern with tears beginning to blur her vision, because she understood suddenly that he was not defending her scientific work so much as claiming her publicly in a way that would make his respect and admiration irrevocable. "Miss Fairfax," he said, abandoning his position in the third row to walk toward the lectern, while the assembled crowd watched with the kind of fascinated attention usually reserved for theatrical performances, "I have one question that has nothing to do with astronomy or mathematical calculations or orbital mechanics." He reached the space directly in front of the lectern, and she could see in his face love and determination and a complete disregard for the propriety that should have prevented such a declaration in such a setting. "I have loved you," Sebastian said, his voice dropping slightly so that the hall had to strain to hear him, which only increased the intimacy of a moment being witnessed by hundreds, since the moment you explained orbital mechanics with such passion that you forgot to be self-conscious about addressing a duke and simply shared your excitement about celestial movements with someone who could appreciate their beauty. He took another step closer, and Arabella gripped the edges of the lectern to keep her trembling hands steady. "I have admired you since I saw how you face adversity with grace," he continued, refusing to let mockery or theft or betrayal dim your commitment to truth and knowledge, and I have respected you since long before the world caught up to recognizing your brilliance, because I had the extraordinary fortune of seeing your mind at work before international acclaim made your genius undeniable." The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as Sebastian reached the lectern and took both of Arabella's hands in his own, pulling them gently away from their white-knuckled grip on the wood, and holding them with a tenderness that made several women in the audience audibly sigh. "Arabella Fairfax," he said, and the use of her full name in this formal setting felt like a claiming that went beyond mere proposal. "Would you consent to be my wife and agree to a life of equal partnership? Unlimited access to the finest observatory in England that I am having built specifically to support your research, and a husband who will spend his days ensuring the world knows your name as the brilliant astronomer you are." Tears were streaming down Arabella's face now, but she was smiling with a joy that felt almost painful in its intensity. And when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the silent hall to be recorded by journalists who would print her words in newspapers across England and Europe. "Yes," she said, the simple word followed by a pause before she added with the kind of spirit that had driven her astronomical pursuits despite every obstacle, "I will marry you, Sebastian, on one condition." She saw his eyes widen slightly with surprise and perhaps concern before she continued with a slight laugh that broke some of the emotional tension. "That you stop describing my work as beyond your understanding," she said, "because we both know you are the only person who truly grasps the mathematics well enough to challenge my assumptions and improve my calculations, and I need a partner who will argue with me about orbital mechanics, not someone who will simply admire from a respectful distance." Sebastian laughed with genuine delight that echoed off the vaulted ceiling where 3 months earlier different laughter had marked her humiliation, and he pulled her hands to his lips to kiss them with a gesture that would have been scandalous if it had not been so clearly rooted in deep respect as well as romantic love. "Then we are perfectly matched," he said, and the hall erupted in applause that started with the French scientists and spread through the assembled crowd until even the most conservative members of the Royal Society were clapping for a woman astronomer who had just been publicly claimed by a duke who valued her mind as much as her heart. Arabella barely noticed when Edmund Tilney rose from his seat in the back corner and slipped out during the applause, his exit unmarked and unlamented because he had become irrelevant to a story that was no longer about his mockery, but about her triumph, no longer about theft and betrayal, but about recognition and love and the fundamental truth that brilliance deserves acknowledgement, regardless of the gender or social position of its source. The president of the Royal Society approached the lectern, looking both pleased and uncomfortable, clearly uncertain how to proceed with a presentation that had transformed into a marriage proposal. But Arabella solved his dilemma by turning back to her charts with Sebastian still standing beside her and continuing her explanation of orbital mechanics as though nothing unusual had occurred. The assembled scientists settled back into their seats with the slightly dazed expressions of people who had witnessed something unprecedented, and Arabella completed her presentation with calm authority, while her fiancé stood slightly to the side, adding occasional observations that demonstrated the intellectual partnership they had promised each other, two minds working together toward understanding rather than competing for dominance or credit. When she finished and invited questions, the hands that rose belonged to genuine scientists interested in her methodology rather than critics looking for flaws to exploit, and she answered each inquiry with the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from years of careful observation and mathematical rigor, proving beyond any remaining doubt that the work was hers and that she understood it better than anyone else in that hall, including the man who loved her and whom she would marry. The presentation concluded to another round of applause, and the Society's president formally acknowledged her contribution to astronomical science, and Arabella gathered her charts and portfolio with Sebastian's help, while journalists crowded forward requesting interviews, and French scientists congratulated her on both her discovery and her engagement. Lady Beatrice appeared with tears of joy streaming down her lined face to embrace her niece and welcome Sebastian into their small family. And through it all, Arabella felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge against Edmund or vindication from the Royal Society, and everything to do with standing in a room that had once witnessed her humiliation, now filled with people who recognized her worth and celebrated her achievements. As they left the building into the cold December afternoon, Sebastian pulled her close and whispered that he was proud of her. And Arabella leaned against him, knowing that she had found something rarer than a newly discovered planet, a partnership that valued mind and heart equally, and promised a future where her work would never again be dismissed or stolen, because she would face the world as the Duchess of Hartfield and the discoverer of planet Arabella, a woman whose name would be permanent in both astronomical records and in the heart of the man who had loved her brilliant mind enough to ensure the world could never again deny its worth. 1 year had passed since Arabella stood in the Royal Society lecture hall and accepted Sebastian's proposal before an audience of scientists and journalists who documented the moment when astronomical discovery merged with romantic declaration. And in that year, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined during those dark weeks of dismantling her father's observatory at Fairfax Manor. She stood now in the magnificent dual telescope observatory at Hartfield that Sebastian had commissioned as a wedding present, a circular room 3 times the size of her father's converted tower, with a dome that opened smoothly on mechanical gears and brass instruments that represented the finest astronomical equipment money could purchase from workshops in London and Paris and Berlin. The November afternoon light streamed through the tall windows that ringed the space below the dome, illuminating star charts that covered every available wall surface, and the mahogany workbenches where calculations in both her handwriting and Sebastian's lay scattered in the comfortable disorder of active research rather than the desperate organization of work being packed away. She was preparing for her 3rd presentation to the Royal Society, though her relationship with that institution had changed dramatically since she had become not just the Duchess of Hartfield, but also the first woman granted official membership, a distinction that had required changing bylaws that had stood for over a century, but which the Society's president had explained was necessary to avoid the embarrassment of excluding a scientist whose work was being celebrated by astronomical institutions across Europe. Her first published paper detailing the mathematical framework that had led to the discovery of planet Arabella was being translated into 5 languages, and she received regular correspondence from observatories in France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and even Russia, requesting permission to cite her work and asking questions about her methodology that demonstrated genuine scientific interest rather than the patronizing curiosity she had once feared would be the best she could hope for from masculine colleagues. The planet itself had been observed by dozens of observatories worldwide, each one confirming that her initial calculations had been extraordinarily precise in predicting not just its location, but its orbital period, axial tilt, and the subtle gravitational effects it exerted on neighboring celestial bodies, and several senior astronomers had published papers praising her theoretical framework as a significant advancement in understanding celestial mechanics that would influence astronomical research for generations to come. She was bent over a star chart marking coordinates for tonight's observations when she heard Sebastian's footsteps on the spiral stairs that connected the observatory to their private apartments below, the sound as familiar now as her own heartbeat after a year of marriage that had exceeded every hope she had harbored during those months of secret collaboration at Fairfax Manor. He entered carrying a letter with the Astronomer Royal's seal and wearing the expression of barely contained excitement that she had learned meant he was bringing news he thought would please her, and she straightened from her work to accept the kiss he pressed to her forehead before handing her the correspondence with the kind of ceremony that suggested its contents were significant. The Astronomer Royal wants you to establish a formal training program for young women interested in astronomical observation, Sebastian announced, before she could break the seal. He has received inquiries from over 30 families asking if their daughters might study under your direction, and he believes that creating an official program affiliated with the Royal Observatory at Greenwich would demonstrate England's commitment to advancing scientific knowledge, regardless of the gender of those pursuing it. Arabella broke the seal and read the formal letter that confirmed Sebastian's summary, her heart beating faster as she understood the implications of what was being proposed, not just permission for her to take on a few students privately, but institutional support for training women in serious astronomical work that could lead to their own discoveries and publications and recognition. "The Astronomer Royal wants me to train young women," she said slowly, testing the words to see how they felt in her mouth. "Can you imagine, Sebastian, a formal program for female astronomers with official recognition and access to equipment and the possibility that some of these women might make their own contributions to the field?" Sebastian crossed to where she stood and took the letter from her hands to set it aside, then pulled her into his arms with the easy affection that had characterized their marriage from the beginning, physical intimacy that complemented rather than competed with intellectual partnership. "I can imagine quite easily," he said against her hair. "You have already inspired dozens of women to pursue science through your published work and public presentations. Why not formalize that inspiration into structured training that gives them the skills and credentials to be taken seriously by institutions that still harbor prejudices against female scientists?" Arabella leaned into his embrace, while her mind raced through the practical considerations of establishing such a program, the time it would require, and the challenge of balancing teaching with her own research, and the complications that would arise when she added another responsibility to a life that already felt full to overflowing. "But with the baby coming," she said hesitantly, pulling back to look at his face and see his reaction to the news she had been waiting to share until she was certain, "and my own research for the next Royal Society presentation, I am not sure I can manage a formal training program on top of everything else." Sebastian's eyes widened, and his hands moved immediately to her still flat stomach with a tenderness that made her throat tighten with emotion, and she saw in his face joy that eclipsed even the excitement about the Astronomer Royal's proposal. "A baby," he said, his voice emerging rough with feeling. "Arabella, are you certain? When did you? How long have you known?" She laughed at his unusual incoherence, this man who could deliver devastating rebuttals to the Royal Society, reduced to stammering by the news that they would become parents, and she covered his hands with her own where they rested against her middle. 2 months, she confirmed. "I wanted to be certain before I told you, and I have been joking to myself that I am conducting observational studies on a very different kind of celestial body, one that requires considerably less mathematical calculation and considerably more patience than tracking planetary orbits." Sebastian pulled her close again, and she felt him trembling slightly, with the kind of overwhelming emotion that he rarely displayed even in private, and when he spoke, his voice carried determination mixed with protectiveness. "Then we will hire assistants," he said firmly, "and build a school if necessary with dormitories and classrooms and its own observatory. Arabella, you have proven that women belong in science, and now you have the opportunity to help others follow the path you cleared, and I will not let concerns about managing responsibilities prevent you from accepting this chance to change what is possible for the next generation." They spent the afternoon discussing the proposal and drafting a response to the Astronomer Royal, outlining what such a program might look like, their collaboration as natural as breathing after a year of working together on research projects and publications that bore both their names, though everyone understood that Arabella's contributions generally exceeded Sebastian's in originality and mathematical elegance. As evening approached and they prepared for the dinner party they were hosting for a group of international astronomers visiting London, Arabella found herself pausing at the mirror in their dressing room to study her reflection, and marvel at how different she looked from the defeated woman who had dismantled her father's observatory a year ago. She wore a gown of deep green silk that Sebastian had commissioned from the finest dressmaker in London, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that her maid had created, and around her neck hung the diamond necklace Sebastian had given her on their wedding night, engraved with coordinates marking the position of planet Arabella on the date they married. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Sebastian, who was adjusting his cravat at the adjacent mirror. "Marrying a woman whose work sometimes overshadows yours in scientific circles, and whose research takes up time that other duchesses might devote to social obligations and estate management." Sebastian turned from the mirror with an expression of such genuine surprise that she almost laughed at how absurd he clearly found the question. "Regret marrying the most brilliant astronomer of our generation," he said, "the woman who discovered a planet and whose mathematical framework is studied in universities across Europe. Never, Arabella. I am proud to be known as the Duke who had the good sense to recognize genius when it presented itself, and the greater sense to claim you as my wife before some other man realized what a treasure had been dismissed by fools." The dinner party filled their dining room with animated conversation in multiple languages. Astronomers from France and Germany and Italy gathered around a table where scientific debate mixed seamlessly with social pleasantry, and where several women sat among the men without anyone suggesting their presence was inappropriate or their contributions less valuable. Arabella moved through the gathering accepting congratulations on her recent publication and discussing the training program she was planning, and she noticed a young woman of perhaps 20 speaking earnestly with one of the French astronomers about her own observational work conducted from her family's estate in Cornwall. She drifted closer to hear the conversation and felt her breath catch when the young woman said with passionate conviction that she had become an astronomer because of the Duchess of Hartfield, because Arabella Fairfax had proven that women belonged in the stars and that feminine minds could grasp mathematical concepts that men had claimed were beyond female comprehension. Arabella felt tears prick her eyes and turned to find Sebastian standing beside her, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture of support that needed no words. And when she met his gaze, she saw reflected there the same wonder she felt at understanding that her work had created ripples extending far beyond her own achievements. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, and Sebastian nodded with a smile that combined pride and love and satisfaction. "You have done more than discover a planet, my love," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "You have changed the world and opened doors that will never fully close again. And every woman who pursues science because you proved it was possible is part of your legacy as much as planet Arabella itself." They received a letter later that week from Lydia, who was now married to a country squire in Derbyshire, a stilted missive that combined apology with self-justification in ways that suggested her cousin still did not fully understand the magnitude of her betrayal, but had been prompted by her husband, or perhaps simple maturity, to attempt reconciliation. Arabella read the letter twice while sitting in the observatory with Sebastian working at the adjacent telescope, and she felt nothing of the rage or bitterness that would have consumed her a year ago, only a distant pity for a woman who had sacrificed integrity for the temporary attention of a man like Edmund Tilney, who had discarded her as soon as his own reputation collapsed. She should respond, Sebastian said, without looking up from his calculations, having apparently sensed her thoughts in the way that had become common during their marriage. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, but holding anger serves no purpose when you have everything you wanted and she has considerably less. Arabella pulled out paper and composed a brief response that acknowledged Lydia's apology, without pretending the betrayal had not occurred, wishing her cousin well in her marriage and her life, while making clear that their relationship would never return to what it had been before the theft. She sealed the letter with her ducal seal and set it aside for posting, then returned to her star charts with the sense of having closed a door on the past that no longer had power to hurt her, because the present was too full of work and love and possibility to waste energy on resentment. As night fell and the dinner guests departed with promises to reconvene at the next International Astronomical Conference, Arabella and Sebastian climbed the spiral stairs to their observatory, where the dome stood open to reveal a sky brilliant with stars undimmed by city lights, because Hartfield sat far enough from London that the heavens appeared in all their glory. They moved to their respective telescopes with the practiced coordination of people who had worked together so often that words were unnecessary to communicate intent, and Arabella adjusted her instrument to focus on the region of sky where planet Arabella should be visible, given the current date and time. "There," she said softly, and Sebastian crossed to stand behind her so he could look through her telescope at the pale disk that represented her greatest achievement, the permanent proof that her mind and her work deserved recognition that could never again be denied or dismissed. "Planet Arabella, right where my calculations predicted it would be at this hour on this date." Sebastian smiled and returned to his own telescope, making his own observations that he would later compare with hers to verify accuracy. And she heard him laugh quietly before asking if she was still verifying her own work after a year of international confirmation. "Always," she replied, settling into the familiar rhythm of observation and notation that had defined her life for as long as she could remember. "Science demands verification even of one's own discoveries, and I would be a poor example to the young women I will be training if I allowed a claim to make me careless about methodology. And that my brilliant wife," Sebastian said with warmth that filled the observatory more effectively than any lamp could have done, "is why you are the better scientist, and why I am grateful every day that you agreed to marry a man whose greatest contribution to astronomy will probably be recognizing your genius and ensuring the world could not ignore it." Arabella looked up from her telescope to find him watching her with an expression that still made her heart race after a year of marriage, love and respect and partnership combined in a way she had once thought impossible, but which now felt as natural as the rotation of planets around the sun. "Shall we observe together?" she asked, gesturing to the dual arrangement of telescopes that allowed them to work side by side, examining the same celestial phenomena from slightly different angles, and Sebastian crossed the space between them to take up position at his instrument while she returned to hers. "Always," he said, the single word encompassing everything they had promised each other in that Royal Society lecture hall a year ago, and everything they had built together since. A partnership of equals pursuing knowledge and love with equal passion, while the stars wheeled overhead in patterns they would spend their lives documenting and understanding and celebrating. The planet Arabella shone in the darkness, permanent and undeniable proof that brilliance deserved recognition regardless of the prejudices that attempted to deny it. And in the observatory at Hartfield, 2 telescopes pointed at the same quadrant of sky, while 2 astronomers worked together in comfortable silence, broken only by the scratch of pens recording observations and the occasional murmured question or comment that reflected minds so perfectly matched that collaboration felt less like work and more like coming home. Below them, the great house stood quiet, servants preparing for sleep. While in rooms throughout the building, evidence of Arabella's dual life lay scattered, astronomical. Journals stacked beside fashion magazines, mathematical calculations mixed with correspondence about estate management, the seamless integration of duchess and scientist that she had once thought impossible, but which Sebastian had insisted was not just possible, but necessary because the world needed women who refused to choose between different aspects of themselves and instead demanded the right to be fully human in all their complexity. Outside the observatory windows, the November night stretched cold and clear, frost forming on grass and bare tree branches catching moonlight. And somewhere in London, Edmund Tilney lived in obscurity, having lost his Royal Society membership and his reputation and his engagement to Lydia when the full scope of his theft became public knowledge. But Arabella spared him no thought because he had become irrelevant to a story that was no longer about his mockery or her humiliation, but about triumph and partnership, and the fundamental truth that love and respect were not competing values, but complementary forces that strengthened rather than weakened those fortunate enough to find both in a single relationship. The baby growing inside her would be born into a world slightly changed by her mother's achievements, a world where at least some women could look at the stars and see not just beauty but opportunity, could study mathematics without being dismissed as unfeminine, could pursue knowledge with the expectation that their work would be judged on its merits rather than on the gender of its author. And while Arabella understood that prejudice would not disappear overnight, and that many battles remained to be fought, she also understood that every woman who followed the path she had cleared made that path wider and easier for those who came after. She recorded her final observation of the evening, and carefully covered her telescope, then moved to where Sebastian was finishing his own notes, and they stood together at the window, looking out at the night sky that had brought them together and that would continue to occupy their attention for whatever years they were granted. The planet Arabella hung in the darkness, a testament to perseverance and brilliance, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. And in the observatory at Hartfield, the woman for whom it was named stood beside the man who had loved her enough to ensure the world knew her genius. Two astronomers perfectly matched in mind and heart, observing the universe together, and finding in that shared pursuit everything they had ever wanted or needed or hoped to achieve.